The terrorist human trafficking scenario has arranged for various simulations, which are based upon the foundation of playing with dolls or Barbie. So you have Barbie and Ken and the rest of the gang who actively exchange in the various narratives of those simulations, actively traded on the black market, from the larger schemes to the more specific schemes, at which point you actively have the position where you just have children playing around with nonsense in order to have their parents entertained, or because their sadist parents are actively entertained by having not gotten over playing with dolls. You actively have these arrangements which are infinitely arbitrary, and their position actively promotes the concept that fairness doesn't belong in the courts when the American courts require the definition of fairness to exist, at which point you have the systematic dismantlement of the American system in the American United States versus the Confederate United States. The rule of law versus the rule of wizards, at which point the simulation of the Barbie becomes the functional narrative for all of their diverse exchanges as they get to do whatever they like, such as, but it's not limited to, the function of James Comey's contracts to make David fight XYZ. At which point, the function of it being a compulsion by their side becomes in the simulation David's action so that they get to write off the series of resources in their favor. At which point you have many distraction narratives, such as do not be happy about someone saying that they will take a bullet for you, because that just means they would rather die than hang out with you. Put in ching. At which point you understand that if the position is that the person isn't to be isolated and that they've been taken away from all of their things, then the replacement in the takings clause has to be satisfied. And the use of that replacement, actively exchanging in that with the coercion of Comey's contracts, then by definition you have a series of not misunderstandings, because no party doesn't understand what's going on. Each and every one of them are thoroughly aware that they are following through on the simulation play, which has pre-written these conclusions in the black market contracts. And the arrangement of these groomers, who, having compromised many of the Republicans first, are engaged in many creepy exchanges by the anti-human rituals of the satanic child sacrifice system, which is systematically used in the foundation of the, I think it's 5G surveillance system, at which point they actively have full control over everyone at the infinitum time period, at which point the only time that they aren't being targeted is the only time that it's them outside of the simulation, because the connection connects to the person who is a speaker, and the speaker doesn't say anything except what the CD says. It doesn't say anything except for what the radio says, etc. So you understand that by definition, they no longer have a say in the thing, but it is merely the simulation of them that is speaking. And since the function is entirely fraud, then you have a series of things in that contract list that are already predetermined to happen, which can then materialize under the false justifications, facilitating the objectives in the black market contracts, which, by definition, is the satanic wizard circle, normal to Marxism and the Hegelian dialectic and the rest of it, as they are actively engaging in the use of switching the subject. If you have five different subjects and you constantly switch which thing you're talking about, then the other person isn't getting confused. They're completely new subjects. And the engagement of those new subjects actively changes everything that they're talking about. So the point isn't that they want to talk, but the point is that they are actively trying to control the entirety of the record being recorded. So if you have the simulation and its script, then the point is to make the exact copy on the screen for the general audience or in the book for the general audience without the arbitrary discomforts of having to put up with a real conversation, which would have led to other outcomes, at which points you specifically have to choose to be some things or other things. So if the position is that the person would view them as a wild animal for supporting a series of policies, and their reaction is to create the simulation where they behave like that animal, by definition, all they did is validate their own position as the animal, having the thing proven correctly about them, which they are narratively trying to avoid assimilating into their own person. Now, this is absolutely destructive as they are a narcissist in an abusive relationship, at which point the exploitation of cooperating with the Confederates materializes the function of everyone's collective dismantlement and collapse, at which point the position of those who are intending unironically to participate in those functions are self-harming in order to destroy their enemy. At which point, if they're hurting themselves in order to injure their opponent, then you're going to have a series of cover stories in the simulation where they pretend to be anything that they're not because of the fact that they would have had to have intended to receive the injury, which they did, in order to acquire the objective which they're manifesting in the wizard communism, at which point you have the simulation of a series of unfortunate events which then manifests the reality that they're looking for with the changes of statuses and accounts and finances for everyone, specifically for the white supremacist objective. So again, if the point is to isolate someone and they mute them, and then they say that the court says that you have to do the average person in that scenario. So you create a cloud, and the cloud has infinite other people who the court picks. Let's say that it's commonly 10 other people. Then, by definition, those other people can buy contracts on the black market with the Confederacy to acquire their objectives concerning the target, at which point they can manifest their own reality. So, if they're trying to get revenge on their target, then by definition, they can act like a jackass under its account and then make it go bankrupt socially or financially, politically, or otherwise, and they can fuck off and then it doesn't mean anything. Or they can exploit it for infinite other objectives, which has nothing to do with it because every one of the exchanges is a forgery for the pre scripted arrangements. And then, if they are acting in good faith as a second party, they still have to deal with the fact that everyone else is doing fraud. And since everyone else is doing a fraud, the only competent, rational answer is to go through a series of terms and services specifically from the record concerning the target and the definitions of the target, which is the express purpose of having met them in the first place for anyone who is on the exchange concerning the secret telephone system or however they want to arrange this mechanism. So if you have a bunch of people who are dealing with a good faith second party who don't want to exchange in good faith, then they're not going to go through the terms and services of what the person's thing is by definition, so that they can then be rude and abusive towards them, manifesting their prescripted objective through a series of strawman arguments as to protect a remedy from any Confederate magics, as they persistently manufacture the witchcraft specifically, at which point the position of The Craft, the movie, I think it was a 1990s movie, where a bunch of girls, I think it was three girls, are all conducting various witchcraft seances, and they connect with a demon or a spirit. At which point, if the KKK is involved for their double agents in the government from Comey's arrangements or any of the other Confederate traitors, then they're just doing nerve hacking and playing God or whatever the thing is in order to manufacture. At which point, the exchanges of them giving a series of wishes is registering the black market contracts, which allows them to actively manipulate for the creation of the outside of law simulation. At which point, the main character wishes to the government wizard to make the boy that she likes like her. And so she goes through the ritual, and then the boy that she likes actively comes after her, as the position of her request demands the sexual exchange. And so the pursuit is compulsory, and it is perceived as overly aggressive and harassment, and she's no longer into it, dissolving the thing. But the subject is that the witch who gave the order is the one who's no longer comfortable with it. And the government wizard who is manufacturing the monkey's paw has delivered exactly what she asked for, at which point the monkey's paw is the rapist in question if the guy was to follow through with having sex with her, and she had asked for it. So by definition, it's just a rape simulation, which she has co-signed and is responsible for, at which point there would be no legal mechanism for her to go against it with the full discovery in place, which creates the position of criminalizing evidence, which allows them to escape the inconveniences of the base reality from their contracts. So the full due diligences of those agreements allows them to have a series of collective ideas which they have agreed to as a byproduct, which, according to their own agreement, according to the compulsion that they are providing through the wizard to the targets, they have agreed to those particular byproducts. They are responsible under law for the simulation which creates those byproducts, which they are liable to pay in its entirety for having created the simulation in the first place. So if they want to play the semantics, then they're engaged in the word games of the spell of the wizards, which have different definitions for the same words in order to cover for their objectives as they are actively manipulating every aspect of the conversation. So you cannot have a reasonable conversation or negotiation or settlement without settling on base reality or the base terms, and thus the act of mixing them creates the intentional subversion from any reasonable conversation, which is bad faith on their end. At which point you have the manifestation of the fraudulent narratives, which allows them to be aggressive or retaliatory or have the pretended feelings being hurt in order to manufacture the position that you have done something wrong, when in fact it was their objective the entire time. At which point you have a system where they're intentionally going to ignore the pretext obligations to the conversation from the due diligences of the validation of the various characters in order to create their own simulation for the predetermined answer, which actively reinforces the ritual abuses which are inherent to the various things, such as the use of the fraudulent um, nonprofits or otherwise advantage, which exist as an alternative to the violence which would have been escaped, redirecting on a schedule back into the violence as though it was permission to receive the violence under the desired outcome, at which point you have a series of defrauding the narratives, which specifically reintegrate back into the satanic uh, sacrifices and various strategies for their objectives in order to enforce their communism, which they are fully aware requires the appropriate amount of time to recover, which isn't going to be allowed so that the simulation can be validated, at which point the engagement of removing the fraudulent mechanism is an essential aspect of each and every conversation, independent to the rest of them, including but not limited to pretending that the other party isn't there so that the conversation becomes blaming the person who's covering for them. So if you have two people who are talking and you have some obnoxious piece of shit make a bunch of noise who draws the attention, you have to speak to the person who's drawing the attention. And the pretending that the person making the noise is them uh, has false outrage about the fact that the person has to be talked down to in order to get them to settle down, who is not the other person that they would have otherwise been having the good time with. So this is actively reacted or enforced or demonstrated in the plays of the court arrangements, such as when the FBI is acting duplicitously and is actively trying to subvert the conversation by saying that it's offensive that someone would think that they needed reasonable suspicion in order to do X, Y, or Z, or that it was reasonable that they could have manipulated X, Y, or Z. At which point, the false outrage presented generates the position that they're trying to manufacture in order to manifest the predetermined answer in that court, which simply proves the original accusation, as they don't have an argument, and so they are filling up the narrative's record with distractions that do not have substance. And since suspicion falls on the unfortunate side, the act of it being on them is not something that they're used to, as they are insufferable bullies and have no actual constitutional integrity by which to withstand the proper stresses necessary in order to have processed through government court, which means they were never legitimately certifiable to enter the court on behalf of the government, as they are and have never been competent enough for the proceedings. Take, for instance, the fact that James Comey's character wanted David's character to engage in the duel against the Confederacy, at which point the position that they're asking about the character has the understanding of their objective, which is to get the duel into the manifestation of the conversation. So they actively promote that subject, at which point it being the compulsion by the use of violence from the harassment is corralling into the specific direction. Now, their acknowledgement that that is base reality would dissolve the entire pretext that they have a right to be offended by, at which point they would have to socially have to start accepting the terms of everyone's mutual safety for the thing to continue, which would be acting in faith, and the act of acting in good faith would allow everyone to be able to enjoy themselves, as there would not be an inherent intention to create systematic dangers.